Well, it's a pleasure to welcome you, Daniel of O.G. Rose. We've shared many conversations together. It's been some time since we've had just a public dialogue, you and I, so I'm looking forward to that. Now, one of the intentions for our conversation today is around this notion of cultural shamanism. Now, this was initially invited as a local event here in Melbourne. Thought it might be an interesting way to catalyze interest around relating to topics like the culture war and transformation and systems, but also in a resonance and affect that invoke notions of healing and spirituality and perhaps the kind of quality of participation that's wanting to address, come into relating with some of these notions in a way that isn't so trapped, something that might serve as some context for bridging identities and energies that do want to relate with the significance of events in our time and patterns of disruption and major uncertainties, but perhaps to do so in a way that might open up some possibility for maybe a little difference in the kind of discourse and the kind of conversation, the kind of interaction and orientation people might usually expect. However, I do believe there's some important broader framings that I think are relevant here. I should also say as well on the podcast, listeners can look back a number of episodes now, might have been recorded last year, I think, with Layman Pascal, was titled Meta Shamanism. Layman speaking there about meta shamanism to not only invoke the historical notion of shamanism, and comes from Eurasia, broadly speaking, the word meaning one who knows, associated with the healer, associated with that person you go to contact divinity, many other things. So it has various indigenous meanings which are relevant, and he's sort of wanting to both include that sensibility, but also recognize the criticality of relating to the transformative technological changes we meet in our time, as well as relating with different cultural logics, identities, this sort of thing. Now, I'm not attached to any of these terms. I'm certainly not here to necessarily try and articulate a unique formalization of some notion of cultural shamanism, but I do think it can serve as an interesting crystallization point, or at least orientation point, drawing things towards it. Now, one way that I thought it might be nice to begin was I was listening to a conversation you had with Michelle Bowens, which I believe you titled Agency and Change in History, which is a great title. And I think it's really quite relevant here. Now, I'm curious how you relate to that to begin with. How do you, as you approach as a philosopher, as someone, author of many books, notably Belonging Again and all its different parts ongoing, how you relate to the context of where we find ourselves in history? And I do believe that if we look at how we can actually participate in influence, and maybe before we get too far ahead of ourselves, how we can relate to that as a project at all, that seems to be quite important from the perspective of cultural shamanism. Now, how do you relate then to that framing as well as notions of agency and change in history?
Well, that's outstanding. And it's a pleasure to speak with you one-on-one. I've always enjoyed these conversations. I think those are wonderful framings. Well, a few things come to mind. Generally, there's a sense that something needs to change. Something is not right. But then, of course, the problem is, and this is a point Benjamin Studebaker has made that I think is very well articulated, it's the notion that the first thing we tend to reach for thinking is new is probably something that's at hand because of the pre-given and the system that exists. The thing that we think is different is probably not actually that different. It probably fits into the pre-existing quite regularly. Like when you say, for example, what we need is the Democrats to win or the Republicans to win, or we need to overturn capitalism or so on and so forth. All of those seem like a change, but all of those changes are actually relatively at hand, given the political discourse, given the economic discourse. It's an illusion of something new. What's very interesting is when we talk about agency in history, one of the things that we were talking about with Mr. Bowens is we tend to associate changing history as changing the state. But if we look at what Mr. Juvenal is saying, that we've actually been tricked today to think that we're freer because we have more individual options, because the state has eroded family, church, religion, community. So we're not bound by communal obligations. So we say we're freer. But actually, what's happened is as we're getting more free in our individual options, the state and government and the economy and all that is growing stronger and stronger and stronger. But we haven't noticed, this was Bernard Juvenel's point in his book On Power, we haven't noticed because we've been given more individual optionality. And so suddenly now we're beginning to wake up and go, oh my gosh, we actually are kind of powerless. But now these power structures exist that are very difficult to change. And that's an example where what we thought was a gaining of agency at hand, which was in our immediacy, was actually a smoke bomb as we lost the middle. And when you look through history, as we were talking about with Mr. Bowens, as you look through history, a lot of what really leads to significant changes in history or changes in culture are not on the realm of like the government, just like this power Leviathan structure, nor is it simply the individual agency. It's in that middle space of the communal, of these new faithful presences, of the new networks, the new creations of cultural capital and different things that we tend to forget about, that we don't notice. And now it's really difficult to think because it has been so eroded. Well, one of the reasons why I do think this connects with shamanism is because basically the shaman, there's this tradition of the shaman leading you into these places that you don't think to go, or that are difficult to navigate, or that unveils to you that you're self-deceived and didn't know it. Oh, you thought you knew what power was? Well, actually you don't, right? And so there's this idea that if we're looking for new alternatives and new agencies and new changes, then we have to somehow see beyond the at-hand notion of what is empowerment and agency and look beyond that. But here's the trick. What we learned from the shaman is that what's beyond that is frightening and scary and counterintuitive and hard to navigate, right? It is surprising. It's always a kind of Lovecraftian entity that is at work. Well, if this is all show and there's this sense that there's something wrong, that something needs to change, or that something is lacking, or the movement of capital, as Studebaker or Cordell, we've been talking about it, Helen Rollins, all these people, like this idea that the movement of capital is so fast now that government can't keep up with it. Individuals can't follow. There's a separation of the increases of wages for individual workers and the increase of profits. If there's a sense that something is wrong, right? Well, here's the rub. Whatever it is that's probably going to correct this will not be something that's probably what you're going to think is what you need to correct it. The thing that is at hand, that is probably a smoke bomb. That is probably not going deep enough into the outer darkness, the strange, to think, right? Koratani talks about the need of a new mode of exchange in his Structures of World History. He calls it exchange D, and he represents it as an X. This kind of, a lot of people will talk about conditions of possibility and these new ways of doing economics, or these new ways of exchanging. And there's this sense of, yes, the new. Well, the secret is whatever that X is probably going to require going into some sort of real, something that's strange, something that's odd, something that's surprising, and something that you wouldn't regularly plan for. Because if not, we would have already done it. That's the trick. Like, if not, it would already be employed, right? And so there's always a weird relationship between agency and weirdness, if you will. The surprising, the unexpected, that of which you would not calculate. And there is, in the tradition of shamanism, I was speaking with Layman, you mentioned the great Layman Pascal on his book on Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff is fascinating. I think you can look at what he talks about as really kind of how do we as subjects come to be able to handle wit, weird, and the surprising, right? Those three sound kind of, ooh, that's kind of odd. Yeah, well, whatever is the mode of exchange X, it probably has to require the odd and the surprising, or else we would have already thought it, right? And we would have already done it. So whatever is going to look like cultural shamanism, if we take that phrase, would seemingly be the net, and then I'll give it back to you just as opening statements, would seemingly have to be the quality of the navigation into the X variable of Koratani of the new, or else we would have already done it. We already would have thought it, and we'd already be mobilizing around it, right? So we can't really talk about new responses, sublations of capitalism, new forms of government, new forms of democracy, new nation states. The moment you're talking about the new fill in the blank, if it's truly new, it entails some sort of shamanistic capacities. If it's truly new, as opposed to simply a illusion, simply a notion of the new that's at hand, that's not really new. It's a pre-configured notion of the new relative to what actually is already part of the consistency of the pre-existing system. A lot of things that we think are revolutions are just going in circles. That's the irony and paradox of the word revolution. It means going in a circle, right? So how do you have a revolution that isn't merely going into a circle, but a true infinity in the Hegel sense that's sublative? It has to have something shamanistic to it. It has to have something odd about it, something that's going into the weird, or again, it would have already been done. And so I think there is something about cultural shamanism. And look, there are a number of people like Leanna Anderson, I believe, who talks about the poly theory, like the poly crisis, instead of metamodernity, saying we need to think about like the Bronze Age, the ancestral, not merely postmodern and modernism, but going further, the pre-modern, thinking about these kind of shamanistic traditions if we're going to think about how dealing with the meta crisis, the meaning crisis, or different things like that. A kind of different mode of consciousness that is more comfortable with the surprising, with the weird, et cetera, so forth. And that seems correct in its orientation, precisely because the new, to really be new, has to have some sort of surprise to it. Some sort of that which you can't plan for ahead of time, only prepare for. So I think framing this as entailing some sort of cultural shamanism, and then that, of course, would be what would the cultural shaman train people to be able to handle that journey into the unknown and the weird, I think is a correct framing. Because whatever is alternative has to somehow be something that's beyond what we would normally think, or we would have already thought it and you'd already be doing it. So I think that framing is important.
Yes, I agree. So initial things which come to mind here are notions of authority. This has been often returned to on the podcast. Part of what the term shamanism evokes for me is a pre-existing investment of trust and authority in the shaman. Now, if we apply that in the context of relating to the radically new, what does this mean? Does this mean we would suppose the shaman or shamanic context to have had prior experience in relating with whatever the phenomenon is? That would seem to be less likely if we're speaking about time spent in embodied living in the context of economic systems to come. If we're speaking about evolution in the context of political economic history, yes, we can look back to different modes of exchange, and we can certainly pay attention to what Michelle Bowens speaks about in terms of the seed forms of various efforts around the world that may be experimenting in different ways of living. But there also does seem to be here, if we're speaking about newness, particularly in the context of system, because of course human beings, we can say, change a little bit less over the course of history in terms of human nature, of course technology changing. But in the case of system, well, how much experience does anyone have living in a way that might constitute some equilibrium of homeostasis over how long? I don't know, right? In the context of what you refer to so often as pluralism, or the world we presently live in which there are seemingly many different articulations of valuation systems which might not share in or know themselves to share in, or have perhaps forgotten that they share in a common form of valuation together at a common basis. Now, there's obviously different angles or derivatives we can take on that expression. Some people might argue, well, actually, well, look, a lot comes back to, rather than follow that, a lot comes back to just how new is new, just how radical is emergence, just what constitutes authority with respect to participation in emergence. In the shamanic context, let's say in the more indigenous meaning, where we might be relating primarily in terms of the healing of people, although, of course, how can people be healthy if the land is sick, if the community is sick, and all of this, and that's very relevant. But nevertheless, if you just grant me for a moment that someone may be suffering from some psychophysiological ailment that is primarily related maybe to the pain in childhood as a result of a betrayal or a trauma experienced. Again, we follow this description far enough, and we might very well have to bring in plenty of things which seemingly have very little to do with the individuals in question. So that remains relevant. But nevertheless, context of trauma, and in that experience of, let's say, healing, where there may be guidance and support for relating, opening up relation to a broader possibility of identity. There's so much to say with respect to the delicacy of healing and the integration of pain and suffering in the context of a maturing life, in the context of tragedy and the movement into the metabolization of tragedy, to the post-tragic. I don't want to speak too quickly in covering this type of thing, but nevertheless, the context of healing, say psychological support, spiritual support for matters closer to the hearth, so to speak, at the level of tribe, would seem to be as impossible as they have been, in a sense, to really heal in the context of intergenerational work as a species. Nevertheless, we seem to be perpetuated. Nevertheless, it seems to be a lot more contained than relating to the whole newness of system, of technology, of changes in the behavior of capital relative to our considerations of time, and however we might wish to language that. And so the question of authority in relation, the question of how to cultivate trust in contexts that are in principle seeking to engage in wiser action at the level of society, at the level of culture, with the resources to change the conditions of possibility and various constraints in the context of whether large organizations, local governments, geographic regions, all of this, that to me points towards the tremendous challenge, because it doesn't seem to me we can, well, I'll just put it like this. There's something of the context for shamanic practice, if we're staying with that term, which has, yes, I think we can say has dramatically expanded, needs to come into relation with larger movements of system at scale, which previously was not relevant. And it doesn't seem like there's anyone standing at the head of that guild, so to speak. And that seems to be a fairly unique, well, is that a unique philosophical problem? Perhaps it's not. What do you think?
Well, a few things come to mind. First off, it's very interesting how there seems to be a connection between healing and courage and facing the unknown and going into darkness. Very often now we overly associate healing with taking a pill or the technological, like using a certain medicine that is a progress of a technological process, as opposed to the idea of, in the shaman tradition, there is a connection between, yes, there is plant medicine, there are forms of medicine, these things are not bad, but there's also a certain idea that you cannot fully heal unless you actually develop certain modes of courage, actually. Certainly without courage, even if you get better, you're still fragile, so you're going to get sick again, right? And so there is an idea too where, when we're talking about the surprising, the new that you didn't see, going into the darkness, there's a certain courage that is required of that. And I think really also a lot of the times, especially in the modern world where there's a kind of radical confusion or a sense of alienation, if we use a Marx term, or a certain kind of overwhelming of complexity, and you feel like you're in a pitch novel or something like that, there is actually something about figuring out how to go into that and face that, that is the development of courage that is necessary, because you cannot go back, right? Like, you've been thrown into the labyrinth and you cannot go back. You've got to find your way out. And if all you do is kind of sit down and, give up moving because you don't know what to do and it's too confusing, you don't heal. You simply close more and more into the mental paralysis that you have, right? So there's an interesting connection between courage and healing. And I think the shaman is an interesting character because, obviously you have this mixture in the shaman of healing, of dream work, of plant medicine, of certain development, of growing up from adolescence. There are all the betweenness. There's something liminal about the shaman in this kind of between worldsness, right? All of this has a certain quality of courage that is developed in that ability to move. Because there's also that notion that only but so many people can be the shaman. But it's interesting because the shaman, in that courage, there's also a certain madness, potentially, a certain craziness that's in that, right? And it's interesting to think is what is that kind of courage that's bordering on the crazy, that's bordering on the doing that of which is socially unacceptable or cannot be absorbed into the social order. Well, oddly enough, if you don't have that kind of person in your system actually, or your social order, it actually becomes more fragile and unable to develop the courage that it needs to actually heal mentally, existentially, in the presence of others, and so on and so forth, right? It makes me think of David Snowden. Snowden will talk about if you have a corporation, you really want to make sure you have that guy that dissents or who's going to tell you that you're wrong, because if not, your system is fragile, right? And so you need those people that are going to dissent. You need those people that are actually able to make you think beyond the immediate to what is beyond that. Otherwise, there is something that is not developed that makes you fragile. And then you're also probably not going to be able to develop the anti-fragility necessary for you to actually heal when there is some sort of devastation or surprise that occurs. So I think one of the issues is then the question becomes, okay, but what is the newness that the shaman is in the business of training you or habituating you to or making you think, right? Because, when we say, well, it's the weird, well, I don't know. There's a lot of weird things you can just do, right? People might think of just doing a Burning Man or something like that, right? Now, again, the problem is a lot of things that maybe at one time had some sort of shamanic character eventually get corporatized and they can lose those colors, right? And some people will talk about forms of Burning Man that have lost that, right? So there's always this kind of what is this thing that you are looking for, right? I should also note that this question of authority, I think there is a tying of who is the one who can actually develop this courage, who can actually make you courageous and carry out this healing. And if they're able to do it, there's a kind of authority that comes from that, right? When we look at the gospel with Jesus, there's this idea that miracle and authority are tied together. And one of the problems is that when you have a society that doesn't have room for the miraculous, and also note that miracle is tied to healing as well, the authority goes to the leaders of the church, which tends to be the dogma, the ones that have the certification, right? So when you don't have a class or a space in your society for the miraculous, the shamanistic, that kind of thing, then authority tends to go in the direction of the certified, right? So when you start talking about new forms of authority, then it would have to be something that allows people to see the individual who can create courage and see the fruits. There's another emphasis in the gospel of by their fruits you will know them, right? It is by the fruit of the Spirit, right? The kind of, now it's very interesting, you say, oh, so pragmatism, right? Well, yes, there is a certain pragmatism and utilitarianism, but it's way, way more deeper than simply economic utility. It is some sort of subjective capacity to handle something. And that if you're able to handle that something, the very fact you're able to handle that something suggests an authority, a certain courage. And if you're able to handle that something, that means you're also healed and you're capable of healing other people. So the question is, what is that something? Well, to me, the difference I think we really need to focus on, especially on the liminal web, if we're going to talk about a restoring of the middle, as I was speaking with Bowens about the commons that offers new modes of exchange, new financial opportunities, new economic opportunities. The key difference that you have to somehow be trained to be able to handle is the difference that Leibniz talks about that can only be known when similar things are brought together in a situation that unveil in that situation and only that situation a difference that could be known no other way, because this is true new of newness, true difference. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay, so Leibniz made this point that two things are similar that you would confuse as something else when they are apart. This is in the analysis of citas. So you have this apple and you have another apple. They're the similar for Leibniz is if when you see them in different places, you think they're the same apple, okay? So similar things are what you think are the same. The only way to find out that they're not the same but similar is to bring them together into a situation, okay? And then you go, oh, they're not the same. They're different. They're similar. The key is that all similarity entails difference, because otherwise it would be the same, right? But here's the key, and we talked about this in the philosophy portal on the science of logic and the analysis of citas. The key is that the difference that Leibniz is interested in is the difference that you can only know when two similar things are brought together in the same situation, because otherwise you think they're the same, right? The key to community, here's the funny thing. The point of community, you tend to make a community out of people you think are similar, right? That's why you made a community out of them. The trick is not that a community is bringing similar to people together for the sake of their similarity. What Leibniz would say to you is, no, you're bringing similarity together to find out how it's different in a way you couldn't know except together. The difference that will shock you, the difference that will surprise you. I thought we were all Christians here. I thought we were all like philosophers here. Actually, we're different. Oh my gosh, it shocks you. You didn't think the people were different. That's why you brought them together into a commons, into a community, and it turns out a difference emerges that could not be known except in the same situation when people were brought together. It is the difference that must surprise. It is the difference that must shock, and it's the difference that you couldn't have known until what you thought was similar was brought together into the same situation, so a difference could arise that you couldn't have known except in the same situation. This is the hard, real difference. The difference that you know is a difference when things are apart is actually not the shocking difference you need the shaman for. Anyone can see they're different. Anyone can be ready for that because you can tell. The real difference that is going to make or break alternative communities, things like the Liminal Web and other opportunities of financial, are do you have people who can train you to handle the difference that only arises when similar things are brought together that must surprise you and must actually really bother you also. It can really feel like it hurts you because you feel tricked. I thought we were all the same. And look, there's this difference that emerges. We don't understand one another. Oh my gosh, I didn't know people could be like this. The shaman that can train people to be ready for that difference that can only be known in similarity that's surprising is the one who will then grant or gain authority in being shown to be capable of that thing that cannot be known but in the surprise. And the one that can then train other people to be prepared for that thing and to spread it and to thus make the community anti-fragile and able to heal from that surprise of the real. There is an authority and also critically a wonder that comes from that authority, a respect because there's something miraculous about it. What we really need, this is kind of the authority of wonder as opposed to the authority of like quote unquote certification power institutions, right? When you see that, that also creates inspiration or trust in that individual that then helps the, dare I say, the possible grassroots movement that can come from that continue to form and grow because there's reason to trust with it because look, we are actually able to handle that surprise that emerged that we couldn't predict. And we are able to keep going, which again, if we think of like what Snowden would say with the corporations, like this is what you need to be able to do because we're really bad at planning the future, right? We're not actually very good at that. The only thing we're really good at, what we really need to focus on is being able to handle the surprise that doesn't shatter us and get really good at identifying what we can possibly do next and to do that well, one step at a time. But why is it that people aren't able to move to the next thing that they possibly can do is because they're not able to handle the shock of difference that can only come up when similar things are brought together, that you need the shaman, quote unquote, that sort of capacity to handle that surprise and walk people through. But that's difficult because you have to be working through the emotional, and I'll give it back to you, the emotional, the psychological, you have to learn how to talk. You have to learn how to go through the phenomenology of the voice. You have to learn how to communicate. You have to learn how to understand that people like this difference is not personal. You have to figure out how to like integrate that into the community and to make it stronger. There's a whole slew of capacities that are necessary there, that if a people show themselves able to rise to the occasion of, that in of itself can create an authority. And here's the rub. If these alternative communities in the middle space for that juvenile or the commons, as Michelle Bowen says, if that space is not able to show that kind of authority, why should they be given economic authority? Why should they be given governmental authority? Why should they be given money? What are they offering? What can they do? Like, why not just keep the authority and money in the people and the institutions who already have it? Because they're doing the only capacity that it shows to be real. Like, what is the alternative capacity that the commons is showing, that these new liminal ways are showing, that should receive money and authority and institutional power in politics, right? What exactly are they doing? Well, if they're not doing this, what are they doing? What is the service per se? Why should they talk about authority? What is it that they do? We know why Amazon has money. They're able to get you a package in 2 days. We know why banks have money. They can move capital. We know why Congresses have authority, because they won elections, right? What is the authority that the liminal web has in what area that should warrant certain cultural respects and economic things, right? Well, I think mastering the capacity to handle the difference that arises in similarity, which is what basically the human race is really good at avoiding and running from, and using various forms of compression through capital, all that other stuff we've talked about, running from, that has led to a very fragile society, and also human beings that are not able to, say, integrate with the environment or integrate with pluralism. We've run from this capacity, and now you could say that's led to the meta crisis, or has led to nihilism or the meaning crisis, right? So if there's going to be some sort of question of authority, the question is, and then I'll give it to you, why should the new space have authority? Right? What is it they do that warrants that authority? Well, because they can handle this. They can handle this surprising difference that arises in similarity. And this is the difference. This is the difference we really haven't thought, I'll dare say. This is not the difference we've thought. What Leibniz is talking about is not the difference we have thought as a human race. We've thought the difference that's obvious. I'm Christian, you're atheist, difference. The other, the Levinas face of the other that's clearly different. Okay, yes, that's a level. That's a certain dimension of the stack we have to get good at. But the deep difference, the one that really existentially shatters people, is the difference that emerges surprisingly between similar things that you didn't know was there. That's really hard. That's even traumatizing. That's really difficult. That's the difference we have to think. And there is an authority to be granted in facing that, because there's a certain wonder and healing that also can flow from it.
Yes, very well said. There's lots there. I would in time anticipate us adding to this category of what distinguishes this kind of authority. But I really like that as an opening. One of the images it brings to mind is that of fractals. Of course, the ongoing flow of self-similar attributes, which nevertheless, if we're now thinking imagistically, and one certainly encounters this kind of phenomenology, psychedelic phenomenology, you can find many of them and see fractals, Carl Jung, in terms of mandalas, famously connoting those images with the archetype of the self. But the unveiling and transformation, the sort of the splitting, the fractalizing from within, that nevertheless permeates the boundaries. So there's kind of in a sense, there is an emergent and emanating aspect to it. And so it is a relationship with becoming. There's this relationship between continuity and discontinuity. Now, the notion of the shaman, if we take it etymologically as one who knows, would seem to me to, and certainly my experience of relating to profound phenomenological shifts, is through engaging, so there's who said this phrase? Someone famous in the world of psychedelic philosophy, Terence McKenna. Do not give in to astonishment. Don't give in to astonishment. Now, in a way, the true astonishment is, in a sense, overwhelming, and so one could potentially name a duration there of a giving in or being immersed in. But regardless, there becomes an opportunity to reorient, recenter, often use a language of returning to breath. We can come to cultivate a relationship, a strengthening of continuity in such a way that this new difference, potentially totally overwhelming, is now, in a sense, commensurable to the coherence of presence that one can metabolize and resonate, and therefore one can become a node or a beacon of strength or solidity in a context that might be otherwise overwhelming for others. And so that whole effort to articulate there is really just an effort to sort of articulate what's experienced in image, but as a sort of it's kind of where image and existential affect are one, are of the same phenomena, are of the same participatory knowing. Now, so I wanted to just share that as another angle of color on part of what I'm hearing you express. But the other thing I wanted to say, which I think would open to something more at the social level, which is if part of what I'm hearing implied, and certainly this seems to me to be reasonable, and in some respects is very much why I bring the notion of authority into relevance here at all, which is that if we are speaking here about the commons to some degree, we're also doing so, I would contend, in the same breath as affirming the criticality of competence and of hierarchy. Now, this is particularly at odds in the present social world at the level of, the people in metamodernism refer to this as kind of value memes, cultural logics. I think generally in terms of identity, but we can think about the social philosophies and institutional orientations that have come to be associated with aspects of postmodernism in integral theory, and people who talk about spiral dynamics, they'll speak about it in terms of green. All these types of things have been spoken about, obviously, a lot. But in this context, there's a real disavowal of hierarchy. There's a real disavowal, obviously, of such things as meta-narratives and various ways of framing the differentiation of capacity for participation in terms of hierarchy. Now, people will distinguish between growth hierarchies and dominator hierarchies, and there's lots to be said in relation to this. Plenty of places for someone listening to pull up and go, whoa, I want to maybe frame things differently here, challenge this here. So it's a challenging thing to speak about, but I do think we presently run up against an issue where the institutional weight of philosophical perspective, kind of embodied unconscious philosophy with respect to such notions of, it's always diversity and inclusion rather than diversity and inclusion and exclusion. The exclusion is shadowed in the context of thinking about how to relate with diversity. Presumably what? All diversities at once, everything everywhere all at once. And that's a real problem. That's a real problem for doing, well, let's say this then becomes a critical problem to relate with in the project of cultivating contexts that are capable of relating with the differences that matter in such a way that can afford the cultivation of the kind of flow of identity that we'd associate with civility in the context of genuine adaptation. Because in a sense, what we are seeking is for civility in the context of adaptation to remain. Or let's say it's no longer the time quite for the shaman, but for the warrior just to fight the other one. Now, of course, there's always a time to, well, is there always, this is another big question. When is too late to arrest the fall? You know, to speak about, of course, causally bound phenomena like ballistic missiles being examples of, well, maybe another ballistic missile or whatever weapon can maybe shoot them down. But at some point, and I often make this example, if I decide to raise my arm up and then release it, at a certain point, I can't stop halfway. I'm sort of bound to the full range of that motion before agency returns. So there's a lot there. Images of the psychedelic phenomenology to begin with, and then questions of hierarchy and meeting present cultural forces which see themselves as leading, but which are not in fact equipped to relate with what we're speaking about. Yeah, I'll stop there.
I think that's all excellent. And, you know, on what you were saying, that these spaces, these kind of different affordances, I completely agree. You know, for me, one of the reasons why I think about that particular Leibniz difference, I might call it, or new difference, Leibniz difference. For me, if you don't have the voicecraft, if you don't have the capacity to wit or beauty or developing sort of maybe various forms of dream works or these kind of psychedelic phenomenologies, then you won't have the capacities to handle that Leibniz difference. Like if you can't handle the difference that's obvious, like the difference between the Christian and the atheist, like that actually, I think a lot of people would associate that with the greater difference. What Leibniz is saying, no, that difference isn't shocking. The existentially destabilizing difference is when you find out your friend is different, that your friend, the person you thought was similar, is not. That's actually more uprooting. That's more like the death of God, the death of like unchained for the sun kind of thing. So I reference that as kind of the highest challenge, which requires a whole lot of different capacities to be able to handle. And in this whole stack, like if you don't have, like we've talked about before, if you haven't dealt with the voicecraft, which I connect strongly with the potential for democracy in a globalized age, like if you don't have that ability to deal with that kind of way to navigate communication that is not merely information, but the full body, full person, then when you encounter that Leibniz difference, you won't have the skill. It will overwhelm you. It will be the Lovecraftian, not the love that moves the sun and other stars, because I always play on Dante versus Lovecraft, if you will, love with the craft in parentheses. So there's a lot of capacities that are necessary for that incredibly shocking difference. And if one can handle that difference and then show they have the capacities for that, then there is a certain authority that comes from that other people can see, that can inspire them, that can then gain cultural capital and cultural say. So I agree with what you were saying. It is very, very difficult, because the other thing I would say is if common spaces or a new global commons doesn't entail that capacity, the commons will simply be a gathering of people that don't go to that depth. It will tribalize. It will not be ones that brings people to that challenge, right? It will just be like-minded people that are like-minded simply because they do not explore the depths. Well, that is what the system is now. It is organizing the social order through a like-mindedness that is more like the banality of evil, or the banality that Hannah Arendt comes from, that is talks about, which is a like-mindedness from a certain thoughtlessness, or a certain, let us reduce humanity to a similar function. It is the similarity of a function, not the harmony of individuals who have learned to actually no similarity is sameness. There's always an excess of a difference we have to learn to work with. You can hide from that by reducing people to simply having the same function to the machine, or being the same kind of person that is functioning in a certain society in a certain way that is intelligible to the system, right? That certain compression, that certain reductionism. Well, if we're not going to do that, then we have to figure out how to have something in common with one another in the fullness of the human being. Right now, we're finding commonality in all being part of the capitalist system, or the economy, or having a job, or fitting into a script, right? We're all the same because we have a script. Well, that's the similarity that is possible thanks to reductionism. Like, you reduce human beings, we're all the same because we've reduced human beings to this same worldview, the same scientific paradigm. There's no emergentism. Okay, well, then you can have similarity there because it's one-dimensional. It's not the Leibnizian similarity that's a result of a fullness that is shocked by the excess that can never be captured in a single dimensionality. There's always an excess when you're dealing with full beings, right? Well, if you want to deal with that full body, that full person similarity, there's always going to be a shock of difference. We didn't want to deal with that, so reductionism was actually a kind of solution to the problem, because you can reduce everything, and then in that reduction, they're similar in a way that doesn't have a difference, because you've simply reduced things to points, into straight lines. So they're algebraic, not geometrical. Of course, please note, they actually are still different, but you're not allowed to think it. You have to repress it. It leads to the psychoanalytical repression, where you have to fit into that reductionist framework, and this creates all the different pathologies. And so everyone's like, well, there's something wrong. Okay, yes. But the way you deal with that problem is to then unpack everything, make it non-reductionist, and that means the Leibniz difference emerges when the things that you thought were similar or will all actually come together and a difference emerges, right? That's the challenge you then have to learn. If you don't want to go the reductionist route, then you have to deal with the Leibniz difference. And that's really hard and requires a whole slew of skills and capacities that I think align with things that you were talking about, or like the voicecraft, or the ability to handle the shock of the real, or the psychoanalytical, or going into the depths of the human being, which is really, really hard. Well, if you're not going to do that, then again, reductionism is the road. That's kind of the only road left by which you're going to go. And if you say, well, that doesn't work, well, then the hard road is the only road, right? So we have to figure out how to take that hard road. I think when you mentioned hierarchy, one of the issues that happens with hierarchy, so there's a question of what is hierarchy, right? There's the hierarchy of, okay, that person can fix an engine, I can't, therefore they're better at fixing an engine than me. Is that not a hierarchy? It is a hierarchy, but it's a hierarchy that's based in the facticity of the thing that they can handle or not, right? Is that an unjust hierarchy? Is that a oppressive hierarchy? No, it's simply a acknowledgement of reality. That guy's an engineer, he can fix an engine, I can't. So it's a hierarchy that's bound to facticity, right? When people are complaining about hierarchy, they're mostly, in my opinion, complaining about what they think is an unjust hierarchy, an unjustified hierarchy, a hierarchy that is not based in some sort of skill or some sort of thing that we can observe and say, yes, that person is better at engines. Yes, that person actually does have a courage that other people doesn't have, right? Like classically, there's kind of an idea that human beings long to encounter a human being that they say, that person's better than me, hallelujah. Like, oh my gosh, the Messiah, the king, right? Like there's a certain like desperation for like humans like kind of want to encounter a great man or a great person, right? They desire to see that sort of greatness, right? Now, what has happened with the death of God, we don't believe that kind of person exists anymore. So then the only sense of hierarchy you have is a kind of unjust, arbitrary hierarchy. And it's a hierarchy that seems to be based on social sorting mechanisms that you don't trust. Oh, okay. They went to Yale, they got a degree, and they're the CEO of a company. Therefore, they make more money than me. They seem to be higher on the social status, but it feels arbitrary. It doesn't feel just. Also, you're not even clear. You don't have a sense of what they do. You're like, why are they the CEO? And it's like, well, because they're the best at the job. Well, what's their job? Computer stuff, right? That's the problem. Like because these people have, like a lot of these people who are at the top of the social hierarchy have gotten there doing a certain technical expertise that the average person doesn't understand or can see, like the engineer with the engine. They don't understand why they're at the top of the hierarchy. So it automatically feels unjust because hierarchies have become unintelligible to people unless you're in that field. Well, then it's specialized, right? So you have specialized hierarchies you can only understand if you're in them. But then the problem is those specialized hierarchies have different economic, political power and acknowledgement. And so you're like, well, some of those hierarchies are better than others, and I can't understand any of them. So it completely feels unjust, right? Because there's an injustice that comes. It's kind of like Kafka. Why does the trial feel like injustice? Because he doesn't know the law that he's broke, right? Like he doesn't understand why he's in trouble, right? There's a sense of if you can't understand the law, even if you broke it, it's still unjust, right? Because it's not intelligible to you. You can't understand it. Like that's why a lot of people are upset with the law because they're like, I don't understand it. You have to be a lawyer. It doesn't feel just. So you say, well, you broke the law. That's why you're going to jail. Well, it doesn't feel justified, right? Well, in that same way that for Kafka, there's a certain injustice that occurs when the law is not knowable. Likewise, there's a feeling now that all of these hierarchies are unjust or arbitrary because the basis of them is unknowable except for the specialists and technocrats in those fields, right? They may know why the CEO is at the top, but then also maybe the CEO is at the top just because it's a kid, but no one in the company is allowed to say anything. So everyone is quiet. So it creates this sense of maybe there's some sort of Gnostic truth here for why they're making more than everyone else. I don't know. Nobody's telling me. So then nobody trusts any of it, right? So that leads to, I think, a kind of knee-jerk against all form of hierarchy because it feels like a lot of these hierarchies are unknowable. It's not understandable why these people are being paid so much more than other people. Like apparently truck drivers are essential jobs that need to work no matter what, but various CEOs and white collar people who make 4 times more, they're not essential work. Whoa, hold on. Wait a minute. So wait, the non-essential work has more political and economic power than the essential work? How does that work? That feels like a Kafka novel, right? So the problem is though, while all of that is a very justified critique, you have to acknowledge there is a just hierarchy, a grounded hierarchy based on the skill of being able to work an engine versus not. And in fact, that's a hierarchy that most people would see and say, well, of course, they're not upset about that hierarchy. In fact, it would be foolish not to acknowledge it. That guy's best at the engine. To deny that would be stupid because we need to fix the engine and we're going to waste time. We need to quickly organize and sort who is the best at engines to get this fixed, right? So the issue becomes, what is the hierarchy that a liminal web or a commons can do that is based on a facticity that everyone can see and go, yes, that's the capacity that I'm clearly seeing that person that has authority, that we're going to turn to that person to actually kind of organize. Some people have called it, like Christian has called it sense making. People can talk about the meta shamanism that Layman is talking about, that capacity to handle the Leibniz difference and to see, oh my gosh, they actually have the capacity, the skill, like the engineer, the mechanic, and I'm seeing it in real time where they're able to do that. They're able to figure that out. Okay, there's a hierarchy there, and and that hierarchy actually, here's the other thing. A world without hierarchy would probably be one that doesn't have inspiration or striving or value or virtue. Is there not inherently a certain hierarchy when you start talking about virtue? It's better to be honest than to lie. There is some sort of notion that this is better to do, and the person that is more virtuous or more beautiful or good or who is an expert in a field, there's a way they have climbed some sort of hierarchy, right? Wouldn't it be a terrible world if there was no possibility of a certain hierarchy, right? I mean, also too, like if there was no generational hierarchy, if literally parents seemed to be just as experienced as children, this would be a very chaotic world, right? So there are generational hierarchies that are a good thing. There are skill hierarchies that are a good thing. There are sense making, there are personal, there are relational hierarchies that are a good thing that actually organize and order society. And then someone like Louis Dumont in his book Homo Herodotus would say, without this, it's chaos. The problem is these hierarchies don't even seem to be hierarchies to us because they don't necessarily receive economic, political, or social acknowledgement. The hierarchies that do are the ones that are in these technical specialized silos that we don't understand, and therefore hierarchy in general feels like a Kafka novel where we are being punished for something that we're not even told what law it is we broke for while we're in the trial. We're not even told what hierarchy we failed to climb. We don't even understand the hierarchy we failed to climb for why we're only making, subsistent wages and we can't afford a house and et cetera, so forth, right? So that leads to this injustice. But the answer to that is not the denial of all hierarchy. It's to think of what would it look like to focus on hierarchies that everyone could observe and see. Ah, yes, that person is best at the engine. Ah, yes, that is the organization of the commons. That is a good community. And to think in terms of creating those kind of things that people can see and that are inspiring, and so on and so forth. So those would be some thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. That's all really good. Okay, let me see. I might take a little bit of time here. Yeah, it's interesting. It feels like part of where I could take this on is now brushing up against the public-private boundary. And there's part of me that's wondering about what's interesting in the context of public. And then there's also the sort of, let's say, closer to the real mess and blood of bumping up against various things in the context of doing this work, which are relevant to speak about. So let's see. All right, let me just go with something that's alive for me, and then we'll see if it's the kind of thing people might be interested in. Maybe we can just share it with the network. I was listening to a conversation. I believe it was on Theory Underground. It was the first conversation I actually listened to on Theory Underground. And it was to do with resourcing. And I believe the person speaking on it, one of the people, Matthew Stanley, was working in a grant application program. And they were saying, I've sort of seen how the sausage is made. Now, I've had suspicions about how that particular sausage is made for a while. But one of the things he said, which I did find to be, it put sort of a ribbon on one of the somewhat lamentable possible positions, maybe necessary positions. Certainly he was advocating for taking in the context of resourcing a life as an intellectual. And he basically said it comes down to which group of elites are you going to be giving alpha to? Which group of elites are you going to be providing a unique edge to? That puts an interesting different angle on some of this conversation. And I'll tee that up further by naming this, which is that in the context of much of what we've shared so far, one of the ongoing movements that has been part of my cognition and approach in relation can be sort of named and expressed in the idea that a big part of the magic of a conversation happens before the conversation takes place. In the context, in the intention, the invitation, essentially that in a way, if there is a quality, skillfulness, therefore something that can also be understood through dynamics of hierarchy, at least in part, if that is already present, then the prepositioning, the framing, the invitation, the invocation. Carl Hayden Smith will talk about contextology. He's not necessarily naming all of this, but certainly the shaping of a context to support the coming together for that criticality, maybe that kairotic interaction, relation with the greater than, all these things we're sort of speaking about. If part of the skillfulness in showing up to be in service of mediating and enabling sort of loving transformative participation in relation to this requires a cultivation of context and time and space and all this type of thing, then we open back into challenges of, in principle, scale of resources, as well in the context, of, let's say, Voicecraft. One of the key contentions is that the quality of the field that is present, as influenced by the totality of people in the space, but again, also as part of the living history of it. And so it extends beyond the room in that sense of what's participating in the support and strengthening of that context. It's holding it to account, but as well as its capacity to relate with an openness and possibility. Then the stepping into a room completely new, where there maybe is not the support in the space, could be seen in a similar way to taking away the medicine from the medicine man, or not allowing the use of the voice for a songman or something like this. There are certain key capacities, whether you could think about them in terms of tools, but they're sort of relational technologies. In a sense, we're speaking not only about psychotechnology, but how sociotechnology supports transformative psychotechnology. Then this opens back up into one of the challenges at the level of cultural shamanism, if we now consider things beyond the immediate relational context. And so brings back in some of these notions of system, where agency lies at levels of social structure, as well as that which mediates infrastructure. We might think about the formulations of power in the digital age, speak about class, speak about all these different types of things. I'm curious for your thoughts on sort of relocating the conversation in that slightly more scaled up sense, and the point around the providing alpha to elites. Part of the complication here is that if it's the case that there are not, in fact, elites in the sense of those who are most skillful regarding the kind of shamanistic qualities we're speaking about, that nevertheless are closer to the agents which have the possibility to influence the conditions that would be providing of the space, and maybe the tools and various things to support the possibility for the magic to happen. Now, there's always that next right step, and so I'm not wanting to get too far ahead of things at all. I was on a podcast yesterday speaking just how much about it's not about getting lost in the abstract, very much wanting to be here in relation to the next right step. But nevertheless, this is the kind of challenge I'm posing us to sort of re-include. I've been thinking a lot about compromise. I've been thinking a lot about a philosophy of compromise, for instance. And, this is potentially something to come back to in different sessions. But would you like me to continue there, or do you feel like there's enough to sort of flow with? Because I could probably wrap some things up if I went back in, but I also feel like pretty much most of the different paints that I'd be wanting to use are sort of in the space, so to speak. So how you feeling about taking it from there?
I'm happy to, but not
Okay.
to jump in on you.
No, well, you're certainly not. I'm I'm inviting you to jump.
Well, you're a gentleman. So there's a few things. So what makes money? What generates money? Well, what creates value or what people value? Okay, well, why do they value X, Y, and Z versus A, B, C? Right? Like what generates a market and what gets resources? Right? Well, generally speaking, when people go, oh my gosh, I need gas because I'm going to fall behind using steam, then suddenly a market for gas stations and then all of these things emerge, right? Something happens that convinces people they need that thing. And then money comes in, right? Or like why so markets are created. So there's a way also too where if you're digging for fossil fuels or gas before really the demand is there, there's a way in which you're ahead of the curve and there's a way in which there's a risk that has to be taken and so on and so forth, right? But there's eventually some sort of force that pushes people into valuing something that before they did not value, right? Like and then the question is why, right? You can look at various fashions. Why do people suddenly in the 90s or whatever suddenly are getting tamagotchis, right? Because there's some force, some cultural force that makes people say that's what I want, right? So what is the move when you have a market or you have a service that then makes people say yes, I want to put money on it, right? Well, there are many factors that create new markets or that kind of push people into saying yes, this is something that needs to be financially supported, right? Like, did what convinces people? It was not always the case that there were colleges. It was not always the case that there were various religions or different things. Something occurred that pushed people to say, yes, this is valuable, right? So there's the first question of when does a service, but when does demand arise for a service, right? And then there's also the question of what comes first, the service of the demand or the demand in the service, right? Seems to be kind of like a feedback loop because a demand begins to arise as something shifts in the global or cultural or social landscape that makes people at least subconsciously go, something is off. And then there tends to be people experimenting, doing things that actually are addressing that demand that they didn't even realize it, or they're kind of experimenting here in these things, this ecosystem. It's like nature. It's like a forest. There's an ecosystem of experiments, of things that are going on that eventually reach an equilibrium, if you will. You could say like, okay, there are lightning bolts that burn down the forest. Okay, well, there's certain brush that actually has the fire go out without destroying the forest. And if you clean that all up, you get all sorts of trouble. But there's a way in which forests tend toward a kind of equilibrium. Now, I'm not necessarily supporting market equilibrium as a notion, that it becomes very complex on what we mean by equilibrium. But like a von Mises would say, there's a tendency towards something like an equilibrium. Now, is it a equilibrium between supply and demand or entrepreneurship and service? That's a question. But if you grant that word, at least in this loose sense, ecosystems tend toward a kind of equilibrium, but in a very experimental and feedback sense, right? Economics are very similar, but they're heading toward creating something that's trying to serve something that doesn't know it's serving it while people are demanding, and it's very messy, but eventually it hits one another, right? And it is this kind of messy process that occurs. And then money comes towards it. The other thing I would say, so hold that. The other thing I would say is that the majority of economic activity often entails people generally doing similar things day in and day out, but it's a similar thing that has a certain value. Now, under modern economics, that tends to be alienating because you're doing something, you're not seeing the finishing of the table, as Marx said. But even before capitalism and industrial societies, the blacksmith is day in and day out doing a similar blacksmith thing. The farmer day in and day out is doing a similar farmer agricultural thing, so on and so forth, right? So there's a whole lot of economic activity that has a certain redoing of a similar thing, right? Just, it's not identical though, but there's a certain redoing. And yet, even if the blacksmith is redoing a similar, there's a new person in the farm that needs it, that they have a relationship, so it feels like it's really helping a person. This thing that you're good at is servicing people who really value it, and you relate to the community and you feel that. So the very fact that it's the same day in and day out in of itself doesn't alienate. This is really critical. There can sometimes be an over-identification with repetition with alienation. No. That's a mistake. Repetition can be mastery.
Can be ritual.
And repetition can actually make you feel really valued in your community because you are dependable. You are reliable. And every time you're able to help people on the farm, help people in the blacksmith. The key to Marxist alienation, it's a repetition of a small part of a whole that you never get the payoff of the finished product, and you get the feeling of helping a community. That's the problem. It's a repetition divided from the completion, okay? But repetition in of itself is not necessarily going to alienate. In fact, it can make you feel meaningful, right? Repetition also tends to generate money. Like, okay, that's a master. We're going to pay that. So there's a demand, a supply, and a mastery. You put those together and you tend to have economic flow, right? So theoretically, if you could say repetitively do a, say, Voicecraft service that there was a demand for, but it was for different people every time in a particular way, and you were able to see the payout for that person, then you, in being a master in that thing, you wouldn't have to think of new ways to do Voicecraft or new philosophers. Maybe you just master Hegel, but you have different people for whom that is helping sense make in their particular confusing modern situation that is really helping them and changing their subjectivity. And you are able to experience that completed process that you in your mastery are able to actually see, right? That would actually not feel like burnout then. That's the key. Like, this is how you get repetition without burnout, because it feels not like repetition, but it feels like mastery, and it's helping lots of different people, right? Well, that requires a market of a lot of people who are looking for that service, who that you can over and over again help them with the mastery that you have that can feel very meaningful because you're able to service all of these different people who need it. Say, the shamanic capacity or the voicecraft capacity or the sense-making capacity, however you want to put it, right? So that can generate a meaning. And then the very fact that it's able to do that and be seen by the larger society as mastery then says, yes, we ought to pay for that. We ought to support it, right? So the question becomes, what creates the market? Well, funny enough, this is where things like the meaning crisis, nihilism, AI, unemployment all might be a great service to these communities, right? Because if these things are going to hurl people out of their capitalist identification, suddenly there can be a new demand for a service that is able to help people navigate this complexity, this confusion, or the fact that, well, they're not able to do the job because AI can do it. They have to move more so to personal relations. You will see an explosion of services and careers in the realm of personal relations and face-to-face interactions because AI is going to do a lot of the mechanical. Oh, well, guess what? All of those are the capacities that we're talking about in sense-making, liminal web, voicecraft, and relating. Suddenly, because of these paradigm shifts, this is where the meaning crisis becomes a sign of hope. This is where all of these sort of crises that are emerging actually are the historic forcing function that pushes more and more people to be looking for these services, that then the people who provide it simply say it's $500 a month. Then they have to, then those people just create the business model, or they ask for the money. Yeah, that's what you have to do. You have to create a business model, and now there's a demand for it. So this is actually where a lot of these things this is the funny, if there is the commons, the middle space between the upper and the lower and Juvenal who has the skills, if that is there, then the polycrisis actually becomes a benefit, because then that is it pushes people into it, and the crisis actually turns into an opportunity if people there are able to receive the increasing demand for those services. Like, if the liminal web or the commons actually provides a service of sense making, if it provides a people to deal with personal, and it actually has mastery in there, and there's a lot of people that can go person by person by person to help with that, well, that's creating a market. The issue is what you have right now. It's kind of like they talk about in business or entrepreneurship. There's a sense in which you're early. You kind of have to be. Like, if it's not early, there's not going to be the mastery for it, right? Like, there's not going to be the capacity. And the question is the following. You just have to ask yourself this. Because, yes, there is a long historical study where you have to somehow get the eye of the elites. That's true. James Hunter with Faithful Presence will say you need to have a faithful presence, a committed mastery of something in connection with the elites. You have to ask yourself the following question. Do you think the future pressures that are coming are going to push some significant percentage of the elites to take the work seriously that's done at Voicecraft? Do you think that is historically going to occur? It doesn't have to be 100% of the elites. Do you think it's going to be 12%, Do you think there will be 12% of elites over the next 5 years because of the shifts that are occurring in the economy, in the society, in the global world, that are going to say, wow, I am interested in different services. I am interested in different capacities, who then for their own sake would actually want to economically fund it? If you think that the meaning crisis really is a problem, if nihilism and polycrat, all of these different really is a problem, then you think that's going to affect the elites, right? At least at some spiritual or psychological level, right? That they're actually going to be feeling those tensions, right? Some percentage of them, maybe 80% of them just kind of close their mind and become more and more pathological and repressive, sure. But do you think there's going to be a percent of them that will see value in it, that will thus be willing to try it? If you say yes, then you should continue these capacities. If you say no, then it might not be a good market. You have to decide if you believe that or not. In the same way that someone who is starting a small business or is starting a florist or something has to say, I think there is a significant percentage of people in this community, or that would see this, that will value it, that will then be able to economically sustain it because they see a real value in it. And I will find meaning in my interaction with these people because I have developed the mastery to be able to address them. You have to decide that from that business standpoint, if you think that is possible or not. If you say no, then you should do something else. 2, you should change the business model. Or 3, you should be okay with writing the grants. And maybe writing the grants, to that example, is okay to get you to the place where you last for the 5 years to get the 20% of the elites who see value in it, right? You may have to do things. Like when I think about compromise, I think compromise, a philosophy of compromise, has to be tied to things like sustainability, survival, avoiding burnout, being able to make it in the faithful presence. If you think about compromise like that, it's not really compromise, it's business sense, right? If you have to write a grant, if you say, yes, I think within a period of time, there will be 20% of elites of whom would be willing to put money down, not because I beg them, but because they see value in this that they need for their own sake. If I think that's going to happen within 10 years, then I need to get there. And maybe that means I charge X amount to join the community, or I do X amount for the grants, or I cut the hours to this. That is wisdom. I think we're not very good sometimes of thinking about differences between compromise, wisdom, sustainability, and so on and so forth, right? You need to, if you believe in what you're doing, if you believe there's going to be a demand for it, it's just a question of the macro forcing functions that pushes people into that market. Then you need to survive long enough to get there. And how can you do that without betraying yourself? That there's a compromise of the wisdom of sustainability, and then there's the compromise of betraying your values. Well, if you betray your values to survive, game over. Can't do that. Okay. Well, how do I do things that are catering to the system that's going to make me sustainable, that's not going to compromise my values? Do those. If you say there are none of those, well, maybe this is not the market, or maybe there's a change in the business model that has to be taken seriously, right? But those things have to be, if there are things that you can do that doesn't make you betray your values or kill the soul of the organization or what you're doing, that's going to make you sustained and survive long enough to see that change in the macro picture, then do those things. And that to me, the word compromise, I don't know if that captures it. I think compromise is a word that has a kind of negative taste in people's mouths. To me, that's just wisdom. That's called vision. That's saying, I actually believe that there will be a demand for this, but I have to get there. That's vision. There's something, vision, if it's going to last, requires some kind of compromise. That is an awareness of what needs to be done to sustain, to last long enough to get to that vision, right? So if you believe it, then you need to do what you need to do to get there. And that will be the hard road. That will not be easy, but there's no other way, if you will, there is no other way to have the mastery before the market appears to be ready for the demand before it's there. In order to have a mastery of a thing, of a skill that you believe is valuable, before the demand is there to receive the demand, to be the first mover, they talk about that in business all the time, first mover, you have to do something like this. You have to do something non-rational. You have to do something where you see a vision and you sustain yourself to make it for the long term so that you are there first. But it's not enough though just to be first. You have to be ready with mastery at the start. right? Mastery. That's the trick. You have to pour a lot of hours into becoming a master for something you don't know for sure there will be a demand for. And thus a certain percentage of the elites that will see a service in it and thus want it. You don't know. That's why there's a courage in it. That's also a kind of shamanic thing. There's a certain there's a kind of going into your own self and your own inner darkness to be able to come to terms with taking that kind of risk. That seems kind of insane, very, very difficult. But I actually definitely think that that kind of courage is part of psychological healing and existentially healing, precisely because it becomes so difficult. But in that difficulty, there can be a subjective development of an anti-fragility that actually heals you, without which I think there can be various sufferings that can occur. So you just have to, and I'll give it to you there, you have to ask yourself, do you think that's going to happen? And if you say no, there's nothing wrong with doing something else. That's not stupid. Or changing the business cycle, that's not dumb. That's fine. But if you say yes, well, then you have to get there and you have to keep developing the mastery while creating the sustainability to keep it going, right? And that's also where you ask questions of, well, okay, how do I do this in a manner that is sustainable, that there isn't burnout, that there's the development of friendship, there's the development of the diner. So I have the community, I have those things that are there where even if the vision doesn't manifest, I've still made friends along the way. You do need to think of those kind of things, but that isn't a compromise. That's a wisdom that is also not compromising the process of surviving to that vision, right? So you think about all that, and then you look at your business model. You look at the model of your organization and say, is it doing those things? Yes here, no here, okay, fix this. You think of it that way. But this is where, again, if one is wise about this, and I'll give it back to you, the very forces of the poly crisis, the meaning crisis, are precisely then the macro changes that pushes a change in the demand of the market to create interest in something that wasn't there before, that then the people who have the mastery for that increasing of number of people in the market can repetitively engage in activity that helps person one by one, that then is meaningful because it really helps those people. And thus there is something that is wonderful in that mastery that doesn't feel like the repetition of the alienation of the widget machine in Marx, but it feels like the repetition of a master that for each individual that arises, one is able to help, that then builds a community, because now you have all these healed people who can then network effect with one another, with yourself, and who knows what may arise from that.
Yes, brilliant. So, yeah, I feel in touch with lots of that. It's interesting, isn't it, how something might first appear as a compromise that one later comes to see as wisdom. I think that can be recognized in many ways in a whole range of different areas of life. There's something about the nature of relating with the ideal or the fantasy, then its relation with the real, that is quite relevant here. I think where at least my existential challenge has been in relating with this was not so much found in what you're addressing there. I find myself to be in touch with that, and some way down the line with a lot of that, and can certainly take a lot of comfort and find a lot of appreciation in a lot of what's been achieved, a lot of what's present, the very possibility of our conversation now, and all the context that it's embedded in. I think part of the orientation in opening this, locating where my sensibility around public and private expression is challenged, is more to do with the existential mode of, I put it like this. About a year and a bit ago, I met this 6-year-old girl, roughly around there, maybe give or take a year, and just an awesome little being, eh? And we just connected immediately, or I felt that way anyway. And she was very inquisitive, and we were actually around a fire, and so a perfect place to just share a little bit of the mystery of life in a way. And, she was interested to learn, and I was just opening a little bit to the beginnings of dialogue. For the most part, I was asking her things, right? I wasn't just lecturing her on stuff. I was asking her questions, and she was really enthused and lit up by relating to them. And it's beautiful to see. About 6 months later, I met a boy who, probably around 9 or 10, he had a parent somewhat in the vicinity, not necessarily, wasn't quite in earshot, but in the space. And this boy was very closed, and he was scared of the very possibility of engaging. Now, I of course noticed this, and I didn't continue to create an existentially difficult situation for him. Although, in a sense, the existentially difficult situation that was encountering someone who opened the possibility for, in this case, the boy to consider whatever in a novel way, and to actually be with the tension of relating with the adult and not knowing the answer, not having that right trivia mind immediate response, and then feeling, under threat or negative because he didn't have the answer. Tremendous possibility for learning, tremendous possibility for education and the cultivation of one's adulthood. And so there's a tension there. It's like, how much, now speaking on behalf of myself, do I disengage so as not to cause stress to this child? Now let's just speak about people in general. Okay, there's a parent nearby. There's some sort of contextual authority that's present that might be mediating and in part responsible for this, child's comparative lack of openness to engage that a girl 5-6 years younger had. Now maybe it's just a situation, whatever, but some kids are like this. How much should I refrain from showing up in a way that is of value and of integrity in a deep way, where that might inculcate some difference and challenge, versus how much do I just, no problem, I'll step away. Now, I stepped away in that situation. To interact any other way was very boring, very, very boring. I had things to do. And so now I share this to then, in a way, like pad out and create in a way, even through story, a slightly abstract and removed location or locating of part of the tension that I think is so interesting here, which is one of the challenges, I think, in, let's say, accepting that maybe the time for sharing one's value is not now, and engaging in the strategy of preparation for a time when it may come to be, in part involves precluding or closing off the energetic investment and the risk of truth, in a sense, one could bring to a person or a context quite naturally. So the saying goes, of course, don't cast pearls before swine. That sense of not wasting energy and effort on someone who is not willing to receive it, not open to receive, and may mistreat it. Hence why for one of many reasons, one of the core sort of opening orientations of underground philosophy was on the criticality of reception to the very possibility of expression and participation in conversation, and all of this as a slightly separate thing. But at the interpersonal level, what seems to happen as people find their way into positions of social status associated with institution, with many people making demands on their time, is they hire assistants, or they become behind gatekeepers. Take someone like Jordan Peterson. Getting in touch with him is not simple, one imagines, unless there's a direct personal connection. He would be managed by agents and all manner of people, contexts, flows, which do not share his mastery or anyone's mastery, right? Because that's kind of their role, in a sense, to take on some of the work that in principle is not requiring that kind of mastery, so as to support the possibility for that mastery to find its place more efficiently. But I'm interested in the latency of the institutional pressures and logics and identities which actually show up as the sort of unconscious dragons at the door, which are barriers to engaging in those contexts and in those possibilities that might in fact be open to the deeper relating. And so if one wants to mediate that, then one might have to play a rather different game. Now, people might associate that very much with cultural shamanism. Can you speak in a language that can be appreciated by this group, even if it might not be a more holistic, more comprehensive, competent language to address issues and complexes that people in some contexts aren't even noticing? But now metamodernism will speak about this, speaking to Tom Lyons about that. So yeah, there's something of the challenging psychology of accepting the limitations that others are placing on themselves when because it's not time, energy, effective, possible to meet them more fully. Now, in a way, it's not so complicated, but I would say that, and that could sound, how I've expressed that can sound in a way I could imagine people judging in different ways. And for the most part, I actually feel in touch with this whole process at a deeply spiritual level in a way that I'm comfortable with. But I definitely admit to tremendous frustration at, and yesterday I showed up on a podcast someone invited me into and allowed just straight up anger to come out with respect to how much bullshit there is to navigate. And there's a real uniqueness. There's a real the balance of integrity at stake in engaging in the tremendous amount of bullshit that's present in order to support and stay with the deep effort to actually treat life and the relational context well, which is very challenging because it's I, for the most part, sort of probably would say that people tend to compromise themselves in relating with how much bullshit there is far before they actually have the skillfulness to not get lost in that bullshit themselves. I would say that's by and large probably what has characterized a lot of people's efforts. And so yeah, it's the notion of sacrifice becomes quite relevant in relation to this too. That's become, it's, you know, it would show up later in my own personal writings of relating to some of these notions we've touched on. And I thought you gave a really excellent response with respect to how you were addressing compromise and wisdom and in general concretizing that. So I appreciated that. But as you see, I'm sort of in a way bringing things back to the existential level of kind of soul to soul relating and the danger of instrumentalizing others in order to serve that greater vision is just a necessary tension to relate with. I don't think I'm not at all suggesting it's a necessity to even frame it like that. But I do think it kind of locates a tension that I imagine others experience, and certainly I've grappled with at various times in my life.
That was all excellent. So first, just as some quick questions, do we think that thinking the problem between the public and private space is a valuable undertaking? And do we think there are skills there that are valuable? Yes or no? I think so. What do you think?
I think yes.
So if we think there are skills and values there, the question is, are there increasingly more people who are at least sensing that this is a real problem, even if they can't articulate it? More and more people are sensing it.
We're trying our best. I'm trying my best.
Let's say there are 0.03% of the world that senses this problem. Do we think it's fair to say that maybe 0.03%, maybe 0.003% of the world sense this problem? Do we think that's the case?
I think that part of what, in terms of the private public thing, I would say that's been one of the contentions I've been trying to make and bring into presence that I would say is fairly limited in appreciation, even in the context of the liminal web.
Sure. So maybe it's 0.1003. It's a very, 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 very small percentage of the world, but something like that, right? So the next question, kind of from a business standpoint, is do we think that over the next 5 years that will move from 1003 to 803? Because this problem, precisely in the internet transparency communal world, will create more and more vividness of this problem that is hard to articulate. But at the very least, we'll move from 1003 to 803 of people who at least sense that. Do we think that is at least plausible to occur over the next, say, 5 years? I would say yes. I think it is plausible to believe. If that is the case, then whether or not it actually occurs, there is the movement, at least, of the formation of a market. Like, that's kind of the key. If we at least think that that is plausible, then you have at least at the bare bones, the movement of the formation of a market. And if you believe that, well, then then there is reason to figure out what this skill is. There's reason to be sustainable as a community focused on this and to somehow get mastery in it, because belief in that, what I just described trajectory, is tied to the economic question and sustainability of the community. If you, for example, like if this is really on your heart, like you say, this is actually, this matters. I want to think this matters. And I believe 1003% of the world intuits this, and over 5 years it will go to 803, then it would be worthy of me to think this problem, to try to master this problem, and to sustain myself long enough to get good at this problem. Now, I'm not saying it's the only problem, but actually I think this problem is freaking huge. I think what you're tracing out is huge. And again, if you buy everything we've just said, this is what it kind of looks like to think a new market, to think a new service, to think a new demand. So I think that's important. Now, everything you said about the public-private divide actually, I think, ties really well to what we were saying with Leibniz. And the reason is because the only way to actually know what is private is to talk in public. If you don't talk in public, you actually don't know what's private. Because suddenly as you're talking, you go, oh, shouldn't go there. Oh, I sense something. So this is where you actually need the public-facing side to actually discern the private. And then in your business model, you actually are using the public to trace out the private. So then behind the paywall or whatever, you focus on the private. Or you send signals to people on the public that, hey, there's a depth here if you want to come across it, where we'll go into the private that we can only know because we're public. Okay? It's like we were saying, the only way to encounter the real difference is in similarity, bringing similar things together. That's when difference arises. The real private, the really difficult private subconscious tensions that you're describing, the only way to find those is through the public. That's why they're emerging on the liminal web and in this podcast culture. There was never the large-scale, transparent telecommunication system to actually provide a way to get a sense of the private at scale, because you didn't have a way for large freaking communication at scale. So these subconscious blockage, you could very strongly argue, have never been globally visible because you didn't have this new public digital space. Now they're visible. In the past, if we want to bring it back to shamanism, maybe a shaman paying attention to his small tribe could see, oh, that's private and not. I can see in these 50 people the private, right? But that wasn't a global private. That wasn't the collective consciousness private. That was just that sociot, that, like a bard would say, that one. Now we have the potential to trace out the global subconscious private, if you will, because we now have a global digital network of which, in being public, shows what it doesn't show. You can sense it, but you have to be skilled in the voicecraft to sense those privates. And from a business standpoint, if you will, you go, okay, I'm doing public stuff to sense out the private, to take a mental notebook or write out what are the blockages that I want to focus. And the private side of it is to focus on that. And you actually need the public-private division, because if you do the private and the public, it can blow everything up. And actually then the private is too much. Here's the key. You actually need the division to see what kind of people are open to and willing to move into that private sphere, right? And if they're not willing to do it, they're probably going to blow up the effort. A wonderful book, because I think so much of this is really strongly tied to the history of religious formation, church history. We've talked about this before. There's a really wonderful book called Secret Faith in the Public Space by John Mausick. And he goes to the question of what is a secret and why are secrets really important? And secrets are not power. And also a secret has to be public or people don't know it's there, right? So there has to be a certain summoning. He makes an example of Gregory of Nicaea. And in the Gregory of Nicaea, there's clearly a division between what's behind the veil and what's on the other side of the veil. But you need to know there's a veil to have a desire to go to the other side, which then you have to humbly move yourself to that place. And Gregory of Nicaea is like, we don't want the people to know about this. We don't want them to. But doing it publicly so that actually the people who are ready for it can step up into it, right? Now, the issue is that can create power hierarchies, that can create all sorts of problematic dynamics. So I'm not saying that's the same thing you want to do today. But the point is that there was a very intentional division between the inner and the outer that was publicly seen for the sake of tracing out deeper things that had to have the public-facing side to be able to trace them out, right? The difference between what Gregory of Nicaea is describing and what we're describing with the liminal web is that you're not publicly saying, oh, there's mystical truths that you can't know. Literally, this is everyone, just talk about what you want to talk and we'll see what isn't talked about. It's a much more free speech. It's not like an intentional veil. Here's the trick. In the Gregory of Nicaea, you are architecturally designing the quote unquote veil in the building. Here, you're letting the collective subconscious be the veil. Do you understand? Like the collective subconscious is itself showing you where the veils are in its very unfolding. Whereas in the history of the church, you had to intentionally say, only the priests go here. No one on the liminal web in that free speech, there is some of that, but I don't think that's the correct method. What you're saying is, oh, actually, just by letting everyone speak freely, you will see that there are in the very collective consciousness of human beings a veil. You don't even have to intentionally design it. It's just freaking there. It just emerges. People just organically won't talk about certain things. They'll move away between certain things. They will sense a field. they will sense a blockage. No one is creating a veil. It just happens. It just emerges. Yes, there are some censorship, attacking people for certain views, and so on and so forth. That definitely occurs. But even in the absence of that, you still see veils occur. And then, of course, the question is, what is being hidden by that vitriol that is actually fueling it? Well, it's a certain wound. It's a certain hurt. It's a certain lack of groundlessness. So even in the vitriol, there's a veil that is not coming forth, that is actually hiding behind the vitriol, right? So when you say, okay, that's what I really think matters in understanding those collective subconscious veils that come into existence simply in the fullness of speech. And then the reason I'm public is to figure out what those are. So then privately, you can go by them one by one and create a space that people who are ready to go into looking at those collective subconscious veils can move into, right? And you then locate the business model of the sustainability on that divide, right? Because then if people are not willing to put $50, are they really that serious? Are they really that committed? This is where money can be a helpful thing to see who's actually serious about it or not. And also, if you actually help people work through those collective conscious blockages, they'll be glad to help sustain it. They'll be glad for the financial support, because otherwise that it's not there. It's not there to sustain them or different things. And I think if we think that problem, that schema that we just described, there will be an increasing demand of people who intuit this problem and who want the skills to figure it out. Because here's the other rub with it. You do have to have some sort of skill to know the difference between that 6-year-old girl and the boy. The things that should be talked about one-on-one and one-on-two and one-on-20. You have to be able to sense those differences. If the failure to sense those differences lead to real consequences in people's lives, and people see that and experience it, they're going to want to figure out how to sense it. They're going to want to figure out to know those differences. And that's a skill that there can be increasingly a demand for. And so knowing what should be brought up. The other thing that is important, and then I'll give it back to you, not everything that you sense shouldn't be talked about necessarily is the place you should talk about now, because it may not be the place of growth right now, right? There are the things that are being blocked. Let's say there are 18 things out of a 3-hour conversation. You say there was about 18 things that I could sense were being veiled by the collective consciousness. 16 of them are not productive to go into now. We first have to go through 1 and 6. The first thing and the 6th thing that came up. Those are what I have to do. Oh, and I have to do those one-on-one with the people they came up with. After I do that, I can do the 7th, which involved one of the person that had to go through the 6th, and I can bring in this new people. Now we've dealt with the 7th. And now that we've done those 3, we can handle the 18th that needs a group of 5. Okay? Wow. You see the ordering of the things you go in, the amount of people that is brought into each one of those private conversations, how you bring in more and more, sensing all of that, taking note of all of that, and doing the shamanistic activity, if you will, of going between the people to bring those people together, that's valuable. And I think that sort of skill and capacity, there will be increasingly more and more demand for, as more and more people find themselves interacting more and more with greater personal interaction, precisely because that's going to be more and more of what humans do in an AI world, and more in an interconnected world, right? So I think what you're describing is a very real issue. And I think a way to think about it that for me helps is realizing you can't actually figure out what is truly the private without the public. And that's how the public serves it. The public is the space where the private emerges. And then once you note that, that's what you focus on the non-public side of, say, a Voicecraft or your community, right? But you're using the public to figure out what the private side of the organization should focus on. The private side of the organization, per se, is not just a repetition of the public side. You could say, if in your business model, you could think of it that way. You could say the public side is to figure out what doesn't come up that needs to be on the private side until we work it to a way. And maybe after you work it, you can think of a public side to do it, right? But there's that movement that's going on. And I think if we think of it that way, then instead of it being a relationship where the public hides the private and therefore is a threat to the private, the public becomes the test to determine what is the hidden, so that then you can figure out how to work on it. Just like how similarity for Leibniz is in what the difference arises that we really need to focus on, as opposed to the different that we know is difference, because for Leibniz, that's not the difference that's really the one you need to worry about. It's the one that's going to appear in similarity. Likewise, the private that we really need to focus on is the one that the collective consciousness that emerges in the freedom of speech is veiling without anyone even intentionally coordinating it. It simply happens emergency. And the one who can note that and the one who can navigate that, I think that would be someone who would warrant the description of cultural shamanism.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm glad that we are bringing this in. Probably the final piece that I would share to incorporate into the tension that I experience in relation to this, which is also on the pulse of some of the recent work I've been doing. Shadow work, people say. How much in the shadow? Hard to say. Certainly, it's been involved in seems to be necessary in mediating my own confusion. And that is the question of risk and the question of the discernment around how much risk one can ask of others, and from a hierarchical perspective, how much risk one can. Well, what do we mean by ask? There's different kinds of ask, eh? There's invitation. I've been watching shows where period piece in, say, Viking England, or Viking Britain, and there you have all manner of people following their lords and kings and thanes to death for stupid reasons, for noble reasons, sacrificing their lives for ridiculous decisions, lives being treated as just another thing to sacrifice for some greater goal. And I do think the question of risk is, and how much risk to, let's get the word here, how much risk to invoke, maybe. I don't know. When we think of, I think Michelle mentioned this in the conversation you had with him, wasn't so long ago, World Wars I and World War II, that people in the West were willing to put aside whatever other divisions they might have had in terms of class and whatever else to die for country. There's some greater than sensibility of what they were bound to, which was worthy of sacrificing for, worthy of risking themselves for. The context of risk and inviting, of invoking, if we're speaking about risk in the context of a kind of asymmetry of perceptual, kind of presently capable metabolizing perception, understanding, asymmetries of understanding in the context of what's of common value. Why are we moving over here? Ask the child to the parent. Well, we've got to, for all these reasons that, you might not understand, but you just basically have to accept it. You've got to come along, right? And who knows, maybe it turns out to be good for the child, maybe not. But there's something about the Jamie Wheel used this term. Now, how much he's describing the same phenomenon here, in a way he's not, in a way he is. So Jamie Wheel being a, how would you say, in his own way, a kind of psychedelic shaman. He will say, use the word shazamming someone in the way that Gurdjieff might have shazammed someone. Okay. Now, And if anybody listening, go back and listen to that conversation I had with Jamie Wheel. In many ways, it's, there's a bit of tension there, but interesting if you stick with it. And we'd love to have Jamie back. Lurking behind the notion of Shazamming someone, and he puts things in such, metaphorical, like there's so much Shazamming, hey? Sounds fun almost, but, it's very risky. And there remains some interesting dynamics here, because partly in the same way that you're articulating, I think quite rightly and interestingly, that the public can reveal what ought be private, I think also there is a coming to criticality of that which is private, which ought be made public. And that is uncomfortable. That can be very uncomfortable. Liberating as well, interesting mix of metaphors there, but can be liberating. It would seem to me that one of the key rate limiters on the present, how much, let's say, the kind of capacities we've been discussing here, how much something like Voicecraft, I can speak on behalf of myself here, might be valued in various contexts, would be measured in the sort of subconscious, intuitive evaluation of how much at risk of being vulnerable, potentially exposed, would I be, as some other person here, not speaking about myself, but also, of course, myself, but part of the shamanic here, and to use the Alex Ebert term of the permissionary part of, we are speaking about, the notion of permissionary is part of, I think, this whole discussion at various points. There's a discernment around how much to risk bringing to light. Bringing to light, in a sense, the various ways that with very imminent presence, we might be bound around light and darkness, that, the weavings of good and evil, the interlocking of various gods are part of the very real context of our own authority and status and bearing and concretization in the present. And that's getting close to what a real rate limiter is here, and in how to navigate that relational element. And so cultural shamanism then, it's it definitely must inspire courage, as we've discussed. Definitely must inspire courage, but also not risk inappropriately, but it must risk. So
No, well, a few things come to mind. So the first is the question of what risk is wise to take, what risk is foolish to take, what risk should you take, what is risk, what is good risk, and so on and so forth. I'll use, again, I'll use, Jesus is interesting as an example, because there's also a certain wisdom of when he avoids people, when he talks to people, what he says to the Socrates. It's not a clean-cut universal, this is what you do, right? There is an risk, and live discernment and even wit are inseparable. Like risk taking, this one of the great problems is that when you really talk about risk, you are talking about something that cannot be systemized. Like if you're talking this kind of risk that you're talking about, we overly think about risk as portfolio management and systemizing. But actually, the deepest risk has some sort of risk about risk. There is a risk about even your idea of what is risk. Like there's a kind of, dare I say, meta risk level that we've completely avoided with risk. Yes. Yeah, that's right. You see, if what we consider risk, we can't risk being wrong about, there's a way in which it's not risk anymore. It's just a variable, right? And so what's interesting in, dare I say, the Jesus example is there's always a certain sort of risk of saying too much, saying too little, so on and so forth. Like some people say it was added to the gospel, and that's fine. But the story of the woman who's being stoned as a supposed adulterer, right? He's talking to the Sadducees and the Pharisees. He basically, almost like a hip hop cipher artist, says, he who has not sinned casts the first stone, right? That's a pretty witty response, Jesus. You're like a cipher hip hop artist. You've got a response there that's saying, well, hey, man, if you're sinless, go right ahead, baby. So there's a boom. Jesus is taking a risk where he's going to piss off the religious leaders, and he did. But he also did it in a smart way that also didn't simply say, you guys are evil. He said, hey, he's who have sinned, throw the first stone. That kind of wit, that kind of discernment, that kind of live figuring out what is fitting for the situation is what Aristotle, following Thomas Jockin, means by wit, that ability to discern in the live situation what the proper response is. That could be wrong. That if there's no risk, that your notion of when you should take risk could be wrong, then it's lacking that ultimacy or that meta risk, and therefore it's not the risk we need to think. We don't think the kind of risk you're describing, in my opinion, because we have no risk of being wrong about risk. Therefore, it's simply a variable to allocate funds or balance the portfolio to take into account. Risk has become a definite problem to be addressed, not something you could be entirely wrong about in your definition of. I think also there's also some other things. Religions, if again I use Christianity as an example, I always think it's very interesting the stress on confession, on martyrdom, and testimony. Paul stresses they will know you by the truth of your testimony. So there's something about if you're going to make something, there's something about the private when it is shared publicly must be story form. Very interesting. It has to be a narrative. You have to tell a testimony. A testimony is in a story structure. Again, David Snowden is interesting to emphasize that with, the children need to go around and collect what? The stories of the society. Well, that sounds like the religious wisdom of testimony. One of the problems, so there's this notion of testimony, which is a public telling of something difficult but life-altering that is in a story form, okay? Then there's the confession. Confession is like, I cheated on my wife or something. Now, some Catholic church is like, well, you tell the priest, but not the public. But then sometimes it's like, no, you need to go and tell the congregation. There's a discernment of the leaders of what, like these kind of things can be kept private, that needs to be kept in family. There's a mediator, right? The confession is in this mediating space. And sometimes the priest says, well, actually, no, you need to tell everyone that. Actually, no, you need to go and tell it to the entire public. So you have testimony, which is where an individual, by their own discernment and choice, decides that there's something they need to share with the wider public in a story form. Because the interesting thing about the testimony is it's basically saying people aren't going to get this life-altering thing that happened if you can't tell the story. So you got to tell your whole story. Well, that's a skill. Telling a story is a skill, actually. So testimony. Then there's the confession, where someone in a place of authority, you go to them first, and then they discern what is the appropriate way to deal with this thing that has occurred, right? And please note, also confession was not critically, I should make this clear, confession was not simply also about sin. If you had a mystical experience, like a Simone Weil, you were supposed to go to the priest, not just tell the public. Like if you had a Holy Ghost baptism by fire, that actually was not supposed to go directly to the public because you may destroy them with this mystical experience. So great sin and great mysticism we're actually supposed to first go private, and then there would be a discernment about the public phase. One of the things that has destroyed, say, the Pentecostal church in America is people have these mystical, and they're just public, and they just talk about it all the time. Well, it's led to all sorts of chaos, actually. So both the deep sin and the deep mystical starts in this, you go to the priest first. Then you have the martyr who says, I'm facing something truly evil, and actually, I feel called to basically sacrifice everything for this. And I believe by that blood, that is what I discern is actually what's appropriate in this situation, right? And notice that testimony, confession, and martyrdom require a discernment of what kind of risk should be taken at what time. And that you have to risk about what is risk. There's a meta risk in all of those, right? But notice how all three of those are necessary but not the same, and strongly stressed as critical for the church to do. They will know you by your testimony. They'll know you by the blood of the martyrs. And if there's not confession, you're screwed. You've got to have that, right? What does it look like for liminal web organizations to take the lessons of that church history and figure out what that looks like in their form today? What is what is a Voicecraft's testimony? What is a Voicecraft confession? What is a Voicecraft martyrdom, right? If you can't think those three things, the problem that you're describing of the gamification of the public and private is inevitable. It will become a gamification. The testimony, confession, and martyrdom is where the rubber hits the road, and you find out if this is a game or if this is actually about changing people's lives. And it is not by chance that the Protestant branch of evangelicism in America, which in my opinion threw out all three of those most, went to the moral majority of the Reagan administration into politics and basically become very problematic. That the religious political mixture that I think has really hurt American Christianity came from the branch of Christianity that, in my opinion, most lost sight of those three. And now I'd have to justify that. I'd have to say a lot more, and I'm not just saying Protestantism in general, but a particular branch of it. But if you take that seriously, then some form of those three missing from the podcast eco-culture will just lead to the gamification you were talking about, right? And figuring out what those three look like today in that ecosystem is what creates a sustainable spiritual culture, if you want to use that can actually change people in deep ways that then creates a feedback loop where that community is actually a true growth of the individuals. But it has something to do with figuring out what those three look like and the skills of discerning which of those three need to be employed at what time. Now, of course, these three things are not the only things the church do. They also do food pantries and practices and, preachers. But these three things are part of the toolkit in a very deep way. And basically, the New Testament tells the Christian church, hey, without these three things, you're dead. You can do whatever. You can have as many food pantries or communal organizations. You can do whatever you want. But if these three things are not in your organization, you will deteriorate. It's only a matter of time. And I think the problem you're sensing between the public and private is, in my opinion, connected in some way that needs to be thought between the lack of these three things in the liminal space that I'm not saying look identical, but something like it that has to be thought. Without that, this problem of risk-taking in a wise way, because Jesus says, be wise as a serpent. Okay, so I'm supposed to be a wise risk-taker, not afraid, but also not stupid. What the heck? Well, these three provide some sort of tools for thinking that. And then I guess I would also just, then there are questions too on risk-taking for what you're going to choose to be involved in, what you think is a useful use of your time. Do you think that the liminal web space is a good risk to take, for example? Because that's the other side of this question, of the risk question that's being brought up. Well, I think it is. I really do generally believe that philosophy and voicecraft and these kind of skills generally can change people's lives for the better. And I believe this space online is the best place to model it for whatever percentage of people experience it. I don't think it's so possible in a university system. I think basically Benjamin Studebaker is right on the way is shut in the political. And I think Michelle Bowens is generally correct on the need to focus on the common space. Those are the things I believe. I've seen the difference that these kind of skills and discernments can have in people's lives. I think it generally helps them in like marriage, in child rearing, in their own stability and comfort with the life choices they've made. I genuinely believe that. And I think this is genuinely the best space by which to go about showing that most effectively, because I think a lot of the institutions in which this kind of thing has traditionally been housed are unfortunately now antithetical to it. And in generally believing that, I think it is a good use of time, even though there are no guarantees of the outcome or guarantees of what percentage of people it may be beneficial to. I believe that if it was beneficial to 12, I always take that Jesus model. If there's 12 people it's beneficial to, well, then that's good. That's worth it. And then simply the question is how to not go bankrupt, how to pay the bills in the doing of it. And then do you simultaneously see potential in it? Do you think there is potentially a growing market that you go from the 10.03s to the 8.03s? If you generally believe those things and you can come up with a life strategy to take that risk, but in a wise and sustainable way, because if you really take a risk and you want to take a risk well, you need to last a long time to take the risk for your entire lifetime. If you take the risk poorly and you're out of the game after a week, you didn't do a good job at taking the risk. So you also want to think about, how do I do a good job at taking the risk, right? Well, that means you're sustainable and you're smart. You're thinking the business. Like if you say, well, I'm just going to take a risk. Well, did you do a good job at taking the risk though, right? Did you do it in a smart way? No, because I thought it would be more risky to just run into it. No, that's actually kind of less risky quantitatively, because you only took it for 2 weeks, where if you would have done it in a good way, you could have done it for the rest of your life. It's actually more risky in a quantitative sense to do it in a sustainable way, because then you have to do it for 40 years as opposed to not thinking about it and just taking the risk for 2 years and then you go bankrupt, right? So in a funny way, it's actually more risk to take risk in a sustainable, smart way, because you have to do it for a longer period of your time. That's how I think about it. I think if you're not wise about taking risk, you actually seem like you're taking a greater risk because but actually you're taking less risk quantitatively because you're not going to last as long. And so those are some things that come to mind.
Yeah, brilliant, Daniel. Brilliant. Yeah. Thank you. That really is excellent. It's phenomenal. Now, where this also leads for me, and I'll bring it to a close here, so thank you very much. One, I do think that one of the right next onwards movements here is for a network session inside the Cultural Shamanism Expedition to take on this relating to the notions of confession, testimony, and martyrdom. In my own writings, after relating with the notion of risk, I remember now return to questions of influence. In a sense, testimony, confession, martyrdom, these are modes of influencing transmembranically, in a sense. It's kind of like it's the necessity of relating to that private public. And I won't say too much more about that, but I think that biology will be an interesting language set and context to relate to this with, obviously, with notions of membranes and what have you. And so, yeah, religion as a body, I think, would be quite interesting in relation to some of this. So I look forward to that conversation. And then let's see about the next time we meet to discuss this topic. I would like to continue our dialogue together. I think questions of influence in relation to maybe what comes through reflections we might have about this conversation, as well as network sessions to come, might be an interesting place to come back to that. So thank you. And thank you to everybody who's been with us and listening. I think this has been tremendously generative. And it's very much an honor to speak with such a tremendous philosopher. So Daniel, thank you.
This has been a delight. You're very kind, and I always look forward to speaking with you. It's been a treat. I think influence is a big topic, and I think it definitely aligns. And I think questions for me of influence and beauty and attraction and showing people something they want to become is very important for those questions. And certainly spaces like this are one that invite that sort of becoming. So I'm grateful for the work you've done to make spaces like this possible.
Yeah, brilliant. And of course, with influence in that way, we're thinking about modeling. And to be honest, for those who might be listening to the podcast just for the first time or first few times, you can really go back and, double click on many things, and you will find that many of these topics, certainly questions of influence, beauty, and what have you, these have all been treated with before. And there are threads which have been well woven, which can be called on and will be woven into future conversations, which themselves have been already sort of shared as resources to engage with, both here as well as on Daniel's channel and many others. We'll share all those as links in the description.